Sometimes, the loneliest souls find each other in the most unexpected places. There's something deeply moving about two people who've given up on love, discovering that their hearts still have room to hope. In the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, schoolteacher Eleanor Whitfield arrived with nothing but her teaching books and a determination to make a difference. The towering cowboy Thaddeus Big Jack Calloway was known for his intimidating size and fierce reputation. When Eleanor's first day at the old schoolhouse takes a dangerous turn, Big Jack appears with shocking words that would make any proper lady faint. "You'll be screaming my name today." But on the unforgiving frontier, those words meant protection, not impropriety. What happens when the most unlikely pair discovers that the biggest hearts often hide behind the gruffest exteriors? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Whitfield had traveled 3,000 miles to reach Cedar Ridge, carrying little more than a worn leather satchel, her teaching certificate, and the weight of disappointment that had driven her from Philadelphia. At 32, she was what polite society called a spinster, a word that stung less now than it had 5 years ago when Thomas Hartwell had broken their engagement to marry a younger woman with a larger dowry. The humiliation had been complete. When he'd publicly declared that Eleanor was too bookish for a proper wife, the morning stage had deposited her at the edge of what could generously be called a town. Cedar Ridge consisted of a single dirt road flanked by weathered wooden buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and horse leather, mixed with something wilder, the untamed smell of endless prairie stretching beyond the last fence post. Dr. Marcus Webb had been the first to welcome her, a kind-eyed man in his 50s, whose gentle manner immediately put Eleanor at ease. "Miss Whitfield, I presume? I'm the closest thing this town has to both a physician and a mayor. We're mighty grateful you answered our advertisement." Behind him stood Martha Henley, the storekeeper's wife, whose calloused hands and sun-weathered face spoke of years spent wresting life from unforgiving land. "Don't let Marcus sugarcoat it, dear. This place will test you in ways you never imagined. But if you've got the backbone for it, you'll find good people here worth fighting for." The schoolhouse sat at the far end of town, a one-room building that had seen better decades. Its windows were cracked, the door hung crooked on its hinges, and the roof showed patches where someone had attempted repairs with mismatched shingles. Inside, broken desks sat in uneven rows, and a thick layer of dust covered everything like a grey shroud. But it was the bell that captured Eleanor's attention. A brass bell that should have called children to learning, now silent and tarnished. Its rope frayed beyond use. This bell would be her first project, a symbol of hope restored to a community that had clearly forgotten the value of education. "Previous teacher lasted 3 weeks, Martha said, noting Eleanor's expression. "City fellow from back east, said the children were too wild, the parents too rough. Packed up after claim jumpers shot out his windows." Dr. Webb placed a reassuring hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "That was 2 years ago. Things have settled some since then." "Settled?" Martha snorted. "Samuel Hawke's been pressuring folks to sell their land. Children run wild without schooling, and half the men in town are too scared to stand up to his gun-happy crew. Only reason we have any peace at all is because of Big Jack." At the mention of that name, something shifted in the atmosphere. Dr. Webb's expression grew thoughtful, while Martha's lips pressed into a thin line. "Thaddeus Calloway," Dr. Webb explained. "Folks call him Big Jack. He's the unofficial protector of Cedar Ridge. Man stands 6'8" in his stockings, shoulders broad as a barn door. His father was the first settler in these parts, owned most of the land around here before he passed. Don't let his size fool you into thinking he's just muscle," Martha added. "Jack's got a keen mind and a good heart, though he keeps both well hidden. Problem is, he's never learned how to talk to people without intimidating them, especially ladies." Eleanor nodded, filing away this information. In her experience, the most imposing men often carried the deepest wounds. "And Samuel Hawke?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Dr. Webb exchanged a glance with Martha before answering. Land speculator from back east. Showed up about 6 months ago with legal papers claiming ownership of half the county. Been trying to buy out the other half ever since. Those who won't sell, he gestured toward the bullet holes in the schoolhouse. Wall. Jack's the only thing standing between Hawk and his plans, Martha continued. But one man can't protect everyone all the time. That's why we need someone like you, Miss Whitfield. This town needs hope, and hope starts with educating our children. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch boards announced an arrival. The doorframe darkened as a figure filled it completely. A man, so large he had to duck to enter the schoolhouse. Thaddeus Big Jack Calloway was everything they'd described and more. His presence seemed to absorb all the air in the room, and Eleanor found herself taking an involuntary step backward. He wore a black hat that shadowed eyes the color of storm clouds, and his long coat couldn't quite conceal the gun belt around his waist. When he removed his hat, revealing dark hair touched with premature silver at the temples, Eleanor noticed his hands, large enough to break a man in half, yet they handled the hat with surprising gentleness. "Doc? Martha." His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. When his gaze settled on Eleanor, she felt as though she were being measured and evaluated. "This the new teacher, Miss Eleanor Whitfield," Dr. Webb made the introduction. "Miss Whitfield, may I present Mr. Thaddeus Calloway?" Jack's nod was barely perceptible. "Miss Whitfield, you should know what you're walking into here. This isn't Philadelphia or Boston. Out here, book learning might save a child's soul, but it won't stop a bullet." Eleanor lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of courage she'd forgotten she possessed. "I'm aware of the challenges, Mr. Calloway. I didn't travel 3,000 miles to be frightened away by threats." Something flickered in Jack's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or approval. "Good. You'll need that backbone." He turned to Dr. Webb. "Hawk's men were seen near the Morrison place this morning. Might want to check on the family." The message was clear. Trouble was brewing. Dr. Webb nodded grimly and gathered his medical bag. "Miss Whitfield, Martha will help you get settled. Jack, thank you for the warning." As the men prepared to leave, Jack paused at the doorway and looked back at Eleanor. For a moment his severe expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Whitfield, if you hear gunshots or see riders approaching fast, you get to the root. Cellar behind the general store. Don't try to be brave, just run." After they left, Eleanor stood alone in the dusty schoolhouse, surrounded by broken furniture and shattered dreams. But instead of despair, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. This place, these people, needed her, and perhaps, after all her disappointments and false starts, she needed them too. Martha had remained behind, watching Eleanor with shrewd eyes. "Jack likes you," she said finally. "I beg your pardon. In 2 years, I've never heard him give a direct warning to anyone but family. Usually he just shows up when trouble starts and handles it. The fact that he told you where to hide means he's already decided you're worth protecting." Eleanor felt a flush creep up her neck. "I'm sure Mr. Calloway is simply being practical. A dead schoolteacher wouldn't serve the town's interests." Martha's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "Keep telling yourself that, dear, but mark my words, Jack Calloway doesn't make many exceptions. The fact that you're one of them might just change both your lives." As evening approached and the last light faded from the western sky, Eleanor stood in the doorway of her new home, a small apartment above the general store, and looked out over Cedar Ridge. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, she knew Big Jack Calloway was making his rounds, a solitary guardian, watching over a town that depended on his strength. She touched her mother's locket, the one piece of jewelry she'd kept from her old life, and whispered a prayer for courage. Tomorrow would bring her first day of teaching, and with it the beginning of whatever story awaited her in this wild, beautiful, dangerous place. What Eleanor couldn't know was that her arrival had already set events in motion that would test not just her courage, but her capacity to love and be loved in return. In a town where survival demanded strength and gentleness was often seen as weakness, she was about to discover that sometimes the most unexpected hearts hold the deepest capacity for devotion. Eleanor's first morning as Cedar Ridge's schoolteacher dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the cracked windows of the schoolhouse. She had arrived early, determined to make the best impression possible on her new students and their parents. The broken desks had been arranged as neatly as possible. She'd swept away months of accumulated dust, and she'd even managed to fashion a makeshift rope for the old brass bell. By 8 o'clock, 7 children had gathered, ranging in age from 6 to 14, their faces reflecting mixtures of curiosity and skepticism. Eleanor recognized the look. She'd seen it before in Philadelphia, though there it had been tempered by social expectations. Here on the frontier, children learned early that adults often made promises they couldn't keep. "Good morning, class," Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "My name is Miss Whitfield, and I'm very pleased to meet each of you." 10-year-old Sarah Morrison raised a tentative hand. "Miss, are you gonna run away like the last teacher?" Eleanor knelt to Sarah's eye level, recognizing the fear beneath the question. "Sarah, I traveled 3,000 miles to be here with all of you. I didn't come that far just to leave at the first sign of trouble." For the next 2 hours, Eleanor worked to assess each child's abilities while beginning basic lessons in reading and arithmetic. She was pleasantly surprised by their eagerness to learn, despite their rough edges and limited formal education. Young Tommy Fletcher could barely write his name, but he possessed an intuitive understanding of numbers that impressed her. Mary, Beth Cooper, had clearly been reading anything she could get her hands on, though her pronunciation needed work. It was just after 10 o'clock when Eleanor heard the sound that would change everything. The thunder of approaching horses, ridden hard and fast. Through the window, she could see 4 riders approaching the schoolhouse, their faces grim beneath the brims of their hats. "Children, move away from the windows," Eleanor instructed, her voice remaining calm despite the ice forming in her veins. She recognized the lead rider from Martha's description, Samuel Hawke, a lean man with pale eyes and a carefully groomed beard that couldn't soften the cruel set of his mouth. The riders reined in their horses just outside the schoolhouse. Dust swirling around them like a miniature cyclone. Hawke dismounted with fluid grace, his spurs jangling as he approached the door. His 3 companions remained mounted, hands resting casually near their weapons. "Miss Whitfield, I presume," Hawke said as he stepped through the doorway without invitation. His voice was cultured, educated, which somehow made his presence more menacing than if he'd been a simple brute. "Samuel Hawke. I represent certain business interests in this area." Eleanor positioned herself between Hawke and her students, acutely aware of how small and vulnerable they all were. "Mr. Hawke, this is a school, and these are children. Whatever business you have can surely wait until after lessons." Hawke's smile was thin and cold. "I'm afraid my business concerns these very premises, Miss Whitfield. You see, I hold legitimate claim to this land, including the ground this schoolhouse sits on." He produced a folded document from his coat. "Legal papers, all properly notarized." "That's impossible," Eleanor said, though doubt crept into her voice. "Dr. Webb assured me—" "Dr. Webb is a well-meaning man, but he's not a lawyer," Hawke interrupted. "The previous landowner died without proper heirs, making this property available for legitimate purchase." His eyes swept the room, taking in the children who pressed closer to Eleanor. "Of course, I'm not an unreasonable man. I'm prepared to offer generous terms for relocation." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. "And if we refuse?" Hawke's expression didn't change, but something cold and deadly flickered in his pale eyes. "Miss Whitfield, the frontier is a dangerous place. Accidents happen with alarming frequency. Buildings catch fire, people get lost in storms, children wander too far from safety. He let the implications hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Behind Eleanor, little Sarah Morrison began to cry softly. The sound ignited something fierce and protective in Eleanor's chest. "You're threatening children, Mr. Hawke. That makes you not just a criminal, but a coward." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Hawke took a step closer, close enough that Eleanor could smell the tobacco on his breath and see the violence lurking behind his civilized facade. "Careful, schoolteacher. Your predecessors thought they could stand against me too. One ran away in the middle of the night, and the other what?" The voice came from behind Hawke, deep and resonant as an avalanche. Every person in the room turned toward the doorway where Big Jack Calloway filled the frame like an avenging angel, carved from stone and shadow. He stood perfectly still, but Eleanor could sense the coiled power in his massive frame, the readiness for violence that radiated from him like heat from a forge. Hawke's 3 mounted companions reached for their guns, but Jack's voice stopped them cold. "I wouldn't, boys. My rifle's already got a bead on each of you, and my finger's getting mighty itchy." Eleanor looked past Jack and saw he wasn't bluffing. 3 townsmen had appeared with weapons trained on Hawke's men. Dr. Webb held a shotgun with steady hands, while Martha's husband Tom gripped a Winchester rifle like he knew how to use it. "Jack," Hawke said, his cultured tone never wavering. "Always a pleasure. I was just explaining to Miss Whitfield about the changes coming to Cedar Ridge." Changes. Jack stepped into the schoolhouse, somehow managing to make the already small room feel impossibly cramped. "Only change I see is you threatening children. That's a line you don't cross, Hawke. Not in my town." Eleanor watched, fascinated despite the danger, as Jack moved with surprising grace for such a large man. He positioned himself slightly in front of her and the children, a human wall between them and Hawke's malice. "Your town?" Hawke laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "Jack, you live in a fantasy. You have no legal claim to anything here, no official position, no authority beyond what these frightened farmers give you. I have documents, legal standing, the backing of legitimate business interests. You have forged papers and hired guns," Jack replied, his voice never rising above that low, dangerous rumble. "Same thing you had in Kansas before they ran you out, and in Colorado before they put a price on your head." For the first time, Hawke's composure cracked slightly. "You've been checking up on me. Man in my position has to stay informed." Jack's storm-gray eyes never left Hawke's face. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to mount up and ride out of here. You're going to leave these children and their teacher alone. And you're going to think real hard about whether you want to keep pushing a fight you can't win." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Eleanor could hear her heart pounding, could feel the children pressed against her back, could sense the violence hanging in the air like an approaching thunderstorm. Then Hawke smiled again, and Eleanor knew they were in more danger than ever. "Jack, Jack, Jack," Hawke said, shaking his head with mock sadness. "You always did think with your fists instead of your head. You want to protect this pretty little schoolteacher and her pupils? Fine. But mark my words, before this day is over, she'll be screaming your name in terror, begging you to save her from the consequences of your stubborn pride." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The crude implication in Hawke's words, the threat barely concealed beneath the veneer of civilization, made her stomach churn with fear and revulsion. But it was Jack's reaction that truly terrified her. The big man went absolutely still, a stillness that reminded Eleanor of a mountain cat preparing to strike. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried more menace than any shout. "Hawke, you just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Eleanor saw Hawke's eyes widen slightly as he realized he had pushed too far, had awakened something in Jack Calloway that should have been left sleeping. But Hawke was too committed to back down now. "We'll see, Jack. We'll see who's screaming before the sun sets." He tipped his hat to Eleanor with mocking politeness. "Miss Whitfield, I do hope you'll reconsider my offer. For the children's sake, if not your own." With that, Hawke turned and strode from the schoolhouse, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor like funeral bells. His men followed, but Eleanor noticed they kept their hands near their weapons until they were well clear of the building. After the sound of hoofbeats faded, Jack turned to Eleanor, and she was startled by the naked concern in his eyes. "Miss Whitfield, are you all right? The children?" Eleanor nodded, though she felt far from all right. Her hands were shaking, and she could taste copper in her mouth where she'd bitten her tongue. "We're fine, Mr. Calloway. Thank you." Jack knelt down, bringing himself closer to the children's eye level. Though even kneeling, he was taller than most men. "You kids did real good staying calm like that. But I need you to go home now and tell your folks what happened. Tell them to keep close to town for the next few days." As the children filed out, chattering excitedly about the morning's drama, Jack remained behind with Eleanor. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, the weight of unspoken understanding passing between them. "Mr. Calloway," Eleanor began, then stopped, unsure how to voice her fears. "Jack," he said quietly, "after what we just went through, I think we can skip the formalities." "Jack, then." Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm morning sun. "What he said about me screaming your name, he was trying to frighten you," Jack interrupted, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "Men like Hawk, they use words as weapons, try to plant fear and doubt. Don't let him succeed." Eleanor nodded, though she couldn't quite shake the chill that had settled in her bones. "What happens now?" Jack's expression grew grim. Now we prepare for war." In the days following Hawk's threat, Eleanor discovered that fear could be a strange teacher. It sharpened her senses, made her more aware of every sound outside the schoolhouse, every shadow that moved past the windows. But it also revealed reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. The children returned the next day, all 7 of them, along with 3 more whose parents had apparently decided that education was worth the risk. Eleanor took this as a victory, small but significant. She continued her lessons with determined normalcy, though she found herself glancing toward the door more often than before. It was on the 3rd day after the confrontation that Jack began what Eleanor would later recognize as his campaign to protect her without overwhelming her independence. She was cleaning the schoolhouse after lessons when his massive frame appeared in the doorway. "Miss Whitfield," he said, removing his hat as he had on their first meeting, "I was wondering if you might have a moment to discuss some repairs this place needs." Eleanor paused in her sweeping, noting the careful formality of his request. "Of course, Mr. Calloway. Jack, I'd welcome any improvements you think necessary." He stepped inside, moving with that surprising grace she was beginning to associate with him. "Well, those window frames are rotting through. Winter's coming, and you'll need proper glass and tight seals to keep the cold out. And that roof," he gestured upward, where water stains marked several spots on the ceiling, "won't hold up to the first real storm." Eleanor found herself studying his face as he spoke, noticing details she'd missed during their previous encounters. His eyes weren't just grey, she realized, but flecked with silver and blue, like storm clouds shot through with lightning. And while his jaw was strong enough to break stone, there were laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a capacity for joy she had yet to witness. "That sounds like a considerable expense," Eleanor said. "I'm not sure the town already talked to Dr. Webb about it," Jack interrupted gently. "Town councils agreed to fund the materials. As for the labor," he shrugged his massive shoulders, "I've got time on my hands." Eleanor felt a flutter of something in her chest. Gratitude, certainly, but also something warmer and more complicated. "That's very generous of you, Jack, but I couldn't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." His tone was firm, but not unkind. "Miss Whitfield, Eleanor, if I may, this town's children deserve a proper place to learn, and you deserve not to freeze to death trying to teach them." The casual use of her first name sent an unexpected warmth through Eleanor's body. In Philadelphia, such informality would have been scandalous. But here on the frontier, social conventions seemed to matter less than human decency and mutual respect. "Very well," she agreed, "but I insist on helping with the work. I may not know much about construction, but I can hold boards and carry supplies." Jack's expression shifted, and for a moment Eleanor caught a glimpse of something like surprise, followed by what might have been approval. Most ladies wouldn't want to get their hands dirty with manual labor. "I suspect I'm not like most ladies," Eleanor replied, then felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized how that might sound. If Jack noticed her embarrassment, he was gentleman enough not to comment on it. Instead, he simply nodded. "I'll start tomorrow morning if that suits you, early before the children arrive." "I'll be here," Eleanor promised. Jack replaced his hat and turned to leave, then paused at the threshold. "Eleanor, what happened the day with Hawk? I want you to know I won't let him hurt you or the children, whatever it takes." The quiet intensity in his voice made Eleanor's pulse quicken. She had known protective men before, her father, her brother William, even Thomas Hartwell in his way. But their protection had always felt confining, as though she were a delicate flower that needed to be kept under glass. Jack's promise felt different, like a partnership rather than a cage. "I believe you," she said softly. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the schoolhouse just as the eastern sky was beginning to blush with dawn. Jack was already there, having laid out an impressive array of tools and lumber beside the building. He'd removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked by old scars, evidence of a life lived on the hard edge of the frontier. "Morning," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Hope you don't mind." "Starting early. Cooler now, easier to work." Eleanor had dressed practically in her oldest skirt and a simple blouse, with her hair braided and pinned severely back. "Not at all. Where would you like me to start?" For the next 3 hours, they worked side by side in companionable silence, broken only by Jack's occasional instructions. Eleanor found herself fascinated by the transformation in him, the careful, almost delicate way his large hands measured and cut wood, the quiet satisfaction in his expression as each piece fit perfectly into place. "Your father taught you this?" she asked as they took a break, sharing water from Jack's canteen. Jack's expression grew distant. "Among other things. Pa always said a man should be able to build what he needs and fix what breaks. Never know when you might be the only one around to do the job. What was he like?" Jack was quiet for so long that Eleanor wondered if she had overstepped. Then he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a silver pocket watch, its surface worn, smooth by years of handling. "This was his," Jack said, opening the watch to reveal a miniature portrait of a woman with kind eyes and dark hair. "My mother. Pa carried this every day for 30 years, even after she died, bringing me into the world." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "Oh, Jack, I'm so sorry." "Pa never blamed me for it," Jack continued, his voice soft with memory. "He used to say Ma would have loved me enough for both of them, and that was his job now. He was a good man, gentle when he could be, hard when he had to be. This whole valley was his dream, families settling down, children growing up safe, a real community where people looked out for each other. And now, you're carrying on his dream." Jack's smile was sad and proud at the same time, trying to. "Sometimes. I wonder if I'm just too rough around the edges, too used to solving problems with my fists. Pa had a way with words, could talk sense into the most stubborn mule of a man. Me," he shrugged. "I tend to intimidate first and ask questions later." Eleanor studied his profile, noting the vulnerability beneath the strength. "I think you underestimate yourself. The way you handled Hawk the other day, you could have simply beaten him senseless, but instead, you used your presence, your reputation, to protect us without unnecessary violence." "This time," Jack said grimly. "But Hawk won't be warned off. Twice. Next time it'll come to blood." They returned to work, but Eleanor found herself stealing glances at her companion, seeing him with new eyes. The pocket watch had revealed a side of him she suspected few people ever glimpsed. The son who cherished his parents' memory, the man who carried their dreams forward, even when it meant standing alone against threats like Samuel Hawke. By the Time the children began arriving for school. They had replaced 2 window frames and made significant progress on a third. Jack packed up his tools with the same methodical care he'd shown in using them. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "I'll be here," Eleanor promised. As Jack prepared to leave, young Tommy Fletcher ran up to him with the fearless enthusiasm of a 7-year-old. Mr. Jack, are you going to be our teacher too?" Jack knelt down, bringing himself to Tommy's eye level. "No, son. Miss Whitfield's your teacher. I'm just helping fix up your schoolhouse so you can learn proper. But you could teach us stuff too," Tommy persisted, "like how to use tools and build things." Eleanor saw something flicker across Jack's face. Surprise, pleasure, and something that might have been longing. "Well, maybe sometime I could show you boys how to make a birdhouse or something. If Miss Whitfield doesn't mind, that is." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Eleanor said, meaning it. The thought of Jack's gentle hands guiding small ones, his quiet voice explaining the satisfaction of creating something useful and beautiful, filled her with an warmth she was only beginning to understand. As the day progressed, Eleanor found her thoughts returning again and again to their morning conversation. She was drawn not just to Jack's obvious strength and protective instincts, but to the gentleness she glimpsed beneath his intimidating exterior, the careful way he honored his parents' memory, the loneliness she sensed in his dedication to carrying on their dream alone. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, Eleanor allowed herself to wonder what it might be like to share that dream, to stand beside rather than behind a man who saw her as a partner rather than a possession. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, opening doors in her heart she had thought permanently sealed after Thomas's betrayal. That evening, as she prepared for bed in her small apartment above the general store, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the cracked mirror above her washstand. Her reflection showed a woman she barely recognized, hair mussed from the day's work, skin flushed from the sun and wind, eyes bright with something that had been missing from her life for far too long. Purpose, hope, and perhaps, just perhaps, the first stirrings of something that might in time become love. A week into their morning routine of repairing the schoolhouse, Eleanor found herself looking forward to those quiet hours before dawn almost as much as teaching itself. There was something deeply satisfying about working alongside Jack, watching his skilled hands transform broken things into something strong and useful again. It was on a particularly crisp morning, when their breath formed small clouds in the cool air, that Eleanor finally found the courage to share her own story. They were replacing the last of the rotted window frames when Jack asked about her life back east. "Philadelphia," Eleanor said, carefully sanding a piece of trim. "I taught at Miss Hartwell's Academy for Young Ladies." She paused, then added quietly, "Thomas Hartwell was the headmaster's son." Jack's hands never stopped working, but she sensed his attention sharpen. "Was?" Eleanor felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied thoughts of Thomas. But somehow it hurt less here in the morning light, with Jack's steady presence beside her. "We were engaged for 2 years. I thought I knew him, thought we shared the same values, the same dreams for the future. What changed?" The question was asked without judgment, without the prying curiosity she'd endured from Philadelphia society. Jack simply wanted to understand, and that made all the difference. His father received a substantial donation to the school from the Pemberton family, Eleanor continued, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. They had a daughter, 18, beautiful, accomplished in all the appropriate ways. Margaret Pemberton would make a perfect headmaster's wife, whereas I was 30 and too intellectual for polite society. Jack's jaw tightened. "He broke the engagement?" Eleanor reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small silver locket, the one piece of jewelry she'd kept from her mother. She opened it to reveal a miniature portrait of a woman with Eleanor's eyes, but a softer, more delicate beauty. "This was my mother's. She died when I was 16, and my father followed her." 3 years later, They had a love story worthy of novels, childhood sweethearts who built a life together based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Eleanor's fingers traced the locket's edge. I thought I'd found the same thing with Thomas. Instead, I discovered that love can be conditional, subject to change based on financial opportunity and social advancement. Jack set down his tools and turned to face her fully. His loss, he said simply. Any man fool enough to let you go doesn't deserve what he's giving up. The quiet sincerity in his voice brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. You don't know me well enough to make that judgment, don't I? Jack's storm-grey eyes held hers steadily. I've watched you with those children, seen how you make each one feel important and valued. I've seen you stand up to Hawk when you were terrified, refuse to run when staying meant danger. I've worked beside you for a week and never heard you complain, even when your hands got blistered from the sanding. He gestured toward her work-roughened palms. You could have stayed in Philadelphia, found another teaching position at a proper school. Instead, you came out here where life is hard and uncertain. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of knots she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten they were. There, Thomas said I was too bookish, too set in my ways. He said frontier life would never suit a woman like me. Then Thomas was an even bigger fool than I thought, Jack said firmly. Eleanor, you got more backbone than half the men in this territory. And as for being bookish, his smile transformed his entire face, revealing the warmth she'd glimpsed in brief moments. That's what this town needs. Someone who believes learning matters, who can teach these children that there's a whole world beyond Cedar Ridge if they want to reach for it. They returned to their work, but something had changed between them. Eleanor felt lighter somehow, as though sharing her story had lifted a weight she'd been carrying alone for too long. And Jack seemed different too, less guarded, more willing to meet her eyes and let her see glimpses of the man behind the intimidating exterior. It was later that morning, as Eleanor was teaching her students about geography, that she noticed riders approaching the town. 3 men moving at an easy pace, but with the alertness of those accustomed to trouble. Her pulse quickened, but these weren't Hawk's men. She could tell by their posture, the way they rode with confidence rather than aggression. The lead rider was a tall, lean man with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore a badge pinned to his vest, and Eleanor felt a surge of hope. Law enforcement, finally. During the lunch break, Eleanor ventured out to find Jack and discovered him in conversation with the 3 newcomers outside Dr. Webb's office. The badge-wearing man was speaking in low, serious tones, and Eleanor caught fragments of the discussion. Reports from 3 counties about this Hawk character, forged documents and intimidation tactics, need someone willing to testify. Jack noticed Eleanor's approach and beckoned her over. Eleanor, I'd like you to meet Marshall, Tom Brandon. Marshall, this is Miss Eleanor Whitfield, our schoolteacher. Marshall Brandon touched his hat respectfully. Miss Whitfield, I understand you had an encounter with Samuel Hawk recently. Eleanor nodded. He came to the school, threatened the children and me. He claimed to have legal documents proving ownership of the school property. May I see those documents if he left them with you? He didn't leave them, just showed them. Briefly, but Marshall, something about them didn't seem right. The paper looked too new, the ink too fresh for documents that should have been years old. Marshall Brandon exchanged a meaningful glance with Jack. Miss Whitfield, you've got sharp eyes. We have reason to believe Hawk's been using forged papers throughout this territory. Problem is, he's careful never to leave evidence behind, and most folks are too scared to speak against him. What would you need from us? Jack asked. Cooperation. Witnesses willing to testify when we bring him to trial. And patience. Building a case takes time, and Hawk's not likely to sit quiet while we do it. As the marshal and his deputies continued their investigation, Eleanor found herself walking with Jack toward the schoolhouse. The afternoon had grown warm, and she'd removed her shawl, acutely aware of Jack's presence beside her. This could be the answer we've been hoping for, she said. Could be, Jack agreed, but his tone was cautious. Problem is, cornered animals are the most dangerous kind. Hawk's not going to go quietly, and he's got men willing to use violence to protect their interests. They had reached the schoolhouse, and Eleanor turned to face him. Are you having second thoughts about helping the marshal? Jack was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Eleanor, there's something you should know about me, about why I've never... He stopped, struggling with words. I'm not good with people the way normal folks are. I solve problems with force because it's what I understand, what I'm good at. When trouble comes, and it will come, I become someone you might not recognize. Eleanor stepped closer, close enough to see the doubt and self-recrimination in his eyes. Jack, do you think I'm afraid of you? You should be, he said quietly. When the fighting starts, I won't be gentle. I won't be the man who fixes window frames and shares stories about his father. I'll be someone whose job is to kill or be killed. Eleanor reached out and touched his hand, feeling the calluses and old scars that marked a life of hard work and harder choices. And afterward, when the fighting's over and the danger has passed, afterward, will you still be the man who carries his father's watch and dreams of children learning to build birdhouses? Jack stared down at their joined hands, and Eleanor could see the war being fought behind his eyes, the battle between the protector he'd been forced to become and the gentler man he longed to be. I don't know, he admitted. It's been so long since I've had reason to be anything else. Eleanor felt her heart break a little for this complicated, wounded man who'd shouldered so much responsibility alone. Then maybe it's time you found out. Before she could lose her courage, Eleanor rose on her toes and pressed a soft kiss to Jack's cheek. The gesture was brief, proper by any standard, but the effect on both of them was immediate and profound. Jack went very still, his eyes closing as though he were memorizing the moment. When he opened them again, Eleanor saw something there she'd never seen before. Hope, fragile but real. Eleanor, he began, but she stepped back, suddenly shy about what she'd revealed. I should get back to the children, she said, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and something warmer. Eleanor, wait! But she had already fled into the schoolhouse, leaving Jack standing alone in the afternoon sun, one hand raised to touch the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. That evening, as Eleanor lay in bed, listening to the night sounds of Cedar Ridge, she pressed her fingers to her lips and wondered what she had started. The memory of Jack's expression, surprise giving way to something deeper and more complex, filled her with both excitement and trepidation. She was falling in love with him. The knowledge should have terrified her, given her history with Thomas and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, as inevitable as sunrise after the long, dark night of her disappointment and loneliness. Whatever came next, marshals and outlaws, legal battles and frontier justice, Eleanor knew she would face it beside the man who had shown her that her heart was not as broken as she'd believed. For the first time in years, she was no longer afraid of hope. The morning after Eleanor's impulsive kiss, she woke with a mixture of anticipation and mortification that made her stomach flutter like a caged bird. What had possessed her to be so forward? In Philadelphia, such behavior would have scandalized society, but here on the frontier, perhaps different rules applied. She dressed with unusual care, choosing her blue calico dress, the one Martha had complimented as bringing out her eyes, and spent extra time arranging her hair. When she arrived at the schoolhouse, Jack was already there, but something had changed in his demeanor. He was more formal, more careful, as though her kiss had shifted the ground beneath them both. "Morning, Eleanor," he said, touching his hat. Brim, but not quite meeting her eyes. "Good morning, Jack." She busied herself arranging her teaching materials, acutely aware of the new tension crackling between them. They worked in relative silence for an hour, replacing the final section of Damaged Roof. Eleanor found herself stealing glances at Jack, noting the way morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair, the careful precision of his movements, the unconscious grace with which he handled tools that looked small in his massive hands. It was when they stopped for water that Jack finally broached the subject that hung between them like morning mist. "Eleanor, about yesterday. I apologize if I was too forward," she interrupted, heat flooding her cheeks. "I don't know what came over me." Jack set down the water dipper and turned to face her fully. "Don't apologize, please. What I was going to say is that I haven't been able to think about anything else since." The quiet admission sent warmth spiraling through Eleanor's chest. "Oh, I'm not good at this," Jack continued, his voice rougher than usual. "Talking to ladies, understanding what they want or need. Most women take one look at me and see either a threat or a convenient protector. You're the first who's ever seemed to see—" He paused, struggling for words. "The man underneath." Eleanor stepped closer, close enough to see the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. "What do you see when you look at me?" Jack's storm-grey eyes held hers steadily. "Someone brave enough to travel 3,000 miles for a dream. Someone who stands up for children even when she's terrified. Someone who works with her hands and doesn't complain when they get dirty." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Someone beautiful enough to make me forget how to breathe." The last words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, stealing her ability to speak. No one had ever called her beautiful, with such quiet conviction, such obvious sincerity. Thomas had complimented her looks in the calculated way of a man making appropriate courtship gestures, but Jack spoke as though the words were being pulled from somewhere deep inside him. Before either of them could say more, the sound of approaching horses broke the spell. But these weren't the threatening riders they'd grown accustomed to watching for. Eleanor recognized Dr. Webb's sorrel mare and Martha's husband, Tom, on his steady bay gelding. "Jack, Eleanor!" Dr. Webb called as he dismounted with unusual urgency. "Thank God we found you together. There's been trouble." Jack was instantly alert, his protective instincts overriding everything else. "What kind of trouble?" Tom Henley swung down from his saddle, his weathered face grim. "Hawk's men hit the Morrison place last night, burned out their barn, scattered their cattle, left a message saying it was a warning for folks who cooperate with outside interference." Eleanor felt ice form in her veins. The Morrison place was where little Sarah lived, sweet, shy Sarah, who'd asked if Eleanor was going to run away like the last teacher. "Is the family safe?" "They're shaken but unhurt," Dr. Webb assured her. "But Jack, this changes things. Marshal Brandon's still a day's ride away gathering evidence, and Hawk's escalating faster than anyone expected." Jack's expression had gone cold and hard, transforming him into the dangerous man Eleanor had heard about but never truly seen. "How many men does Hawk have with him now?" "Best count we have is 8, maybe 10, Tom replied. "All experienced with guns, all willing to use them." "And how many can we count on from town?" Dr. Webb and Tom exchanged glances. "Maybe 6 men willing to fight," Dr. Webb admitted. "The others have families to protect, businesses they can't afford to lose." Eleanor watched Jack process this information, saw him calculating odds and strategies with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd faced impossible situations before. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority she'd never heard from him. "Tom, I need you to ride to the Petersons and the Fletchers. Tell them to bring their families into town, stay at the church or the general store until this is over. Doc, can you get word to Marshal Brandon about what happened?" "Already sent my boy riding hard to find him," Dr. Webb confirmed. Jack nodded, then turned to Eleanor. "Eleanor, I need you to close the school for the rest of the week. This isn't safe anymore." "Absolutely not." The words came out sharper than Eleanor intended. "These children need stability, need to know that their education isn't going to be another casualty of Hawk's intimidation." "Eleanor, Jack, those children look to me for safety and normalcy. If I close the school every time there's danger, I'm teaching them to live in fear. That's not the lesson I came here to give." Jack's jaw tightened with frustration. "You're being stubborn. I'm being necessary." Eleanor lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of determination she'd discovered since coming to Cedar Ridge. "But I have a compromise to suggest." "I'm listening." Let me move the school temporarily. We could use the back room of the general store, or even hold classes outside when weather permits. Somewhere more public, harder for Hawk's men to threaten. Without witnesses, Dr. Webb nodded approvingly. That's actually not a bad idea. Keep the children's routine as normal as possible while making them harder targets. Jack was quiet for a long moment, clearly torn between his protective instincts and his respect for Eleanor's judgment. If we do this, there are conditions. You don't go anywhere alone. One of us escorts you everywhere, including to and from your apartment, and at the first sign of real trouble, you get those children to safety and yourself out of harm's way. Agreed, Eleanor said, though part of her chafed at the restrictions. As Dr. Webb and Tom rode off to spread word and make arrangements, Jack lingered beside Eleanor. The tender moment they'd shared seemed like hours ago, replaced by the harsh realities of frontier life. Eleanor, Jack said quietly, what I said before about how I see you, that doesn't change because of this. But you need to understand what's coming. When Hawk makes his final move, people are going to get hurt, maybe killed. I won't be able to protect everyone, and I won't be able to be gentle about how I handle it. Eleanor studied his face, noting the way tension had settled around his eyes, the rigid set of his shoulders. Are you trying to warn me away from caring about you? Maybe, he admitted. You've seen me fixing roofs and talking about my father's dreams. You haven't seen me in a gunfight, haven't watched me do what I do to men who threaten people I care about. Eleanor reached out and took his hand, feeling the strength and barely controlled violence in his fingers. Jack, do you think your father never had to fight to protect what he built here? Jack's expression flickered with surprise. He was a peaceful man. He was a man who chose peace when possible and violence when necessary, Eleanor interrupted. Just like you. The gentleness I see in you isn't weakness that disappears when you fight. It's what makes the fighting worthwhile. For a moment, Jack looked almost vulnerable again. Then he squeezed her hand gently and released it. I hope you still feel that way when this is over. That afternoon, Eleanor held her first class in the back room of the general store, using Martha's accounting table as her desk and crates as makeshift seats for the children. It wasn't ideal, but it worked, and more importantly, it kept the children together and engaged in learning despite the growing tension in town. As the day wore on, Eleanor found herself thinking about Jack's words. His admission that he saw her as beautiful, his warning about the violence to come, his fear that she might not be able to accept all aspects of who he was. She understood his concern. Thomas had been a civilized man who'd still found her too challenging, too independent for his taste. But Jack was different. He didn't want to change her or cage her. He wanted to protect her right to be exactly who she was. That distinction made all the difference in the world. That evening, as promised, Jack escorted her to her apartment above the general store. They walked in comfortable silence through the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, past windows already shuttered against the night and the uncertain days ahead. At her door, Jack paused. Eleanor, there's something I want to give you. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small wooden figure, a horse carved with exquisite detail, from the flowing mane to the powerful hindquarters. Eleanor gasped as she took it, running, her fingers over the smooth wood. Jack, this is beautiful. You made this? Started it a few days ago, he said, suddenly shy. Figured you might like having something, well, something to remember that not everything out here is harsh or dangerous. There's beauty, too, if you know how to look for it. Eleanor cradled the wooden horse against her chest, deeply moved by the gesture. The carving represented hours of patient work, careful attention to detail, the same gentle skill she'd watched him use on the schoolhouse repairs. It's perfect, she whispered. Thank you. Jack smiled, the real smile that transformed his entire face. You're welcome. As Eleanor prepared for bed that night, she placed the wooden horse on her small bedside table where she could see it first, a thing each morning. It would serve as a reminder of the man who'd carved it, the protector who was also an artist, the fighter who dreamed of teaching children to build birdhouses, the lonely soul who'd found the courage to hope for love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new tests of their growing relationship. But tonight, Eleanor fell asleep holding the wooden horse and thinking about the hands that had created it. Hands strong enough to build and destroy, gentle enough to create beauty, tender enough to hold her heart if she was brave enough to trust him with it. 3 days into the new arrangement, Eleanor had grown accustomed to teaching in the cramped back room of the general store. The children adapted with the resilience of youth, treating the change as an adventure rather than an inconvenience. Martha proved to be an unexpected ally, often lingering nearby during lessons and occasionally contributing practical knowledge about frontier life that no textbook could provide. It was during one such lesson, Eleanor was teaching the older children about state capitals while the younger ones practiced their letters, that little Tommy Fletcher tugged on her skirt with urgent insistence. "Miss Eleanor," he whispered, "there's men outside watching the store. They don't look friendly." Eleanor's blood chilled, but she kept her voice calm and steady. "Children, let's practice our quiet reading time. Mary Beth, would you help the younger ones with their alphabet books?" She moved casually to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. 3 riders sat their horses across the street, making no attempt to hide their surveillance. She recognized 2 of them from Hawk's group, but the third was a stranger, a thin, nervous-looking man with pale eyes and restless hands. Moving carefully to avoid drawing attention, Eleanor slipped into the main store where Martha was arranging bolts of fabric. "Martha, we have watchers outside, 3 of them." Martha's hands never paused in their work, but Eleanor saw her jaw tighten. "Tom's in the back room checking inventory. I'll signal him to fetch Jack." "No," Eleanor said quickly. "If they see unusual activity, they might act before help arrives." "Is there another way out of here?" "Root cellar," Martha replied. "Door behind the flour barrels. Leads to a tunnel Tom dug when the Indian troubles were bad 5 years ago. Comes out near the church." Eleanor nodded, her mind racing. "If I move the children now—" "They'll see," Martha interrupted. "Better to wait. Act normal. Those men are just watching for now." The next 20 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Eleanor continued the lesson, but every fiber of her being was alert to the danger outside. The children sensed her tension, despite her efforts to hide it, and even the youngest grew quiet and watchful. It was Mary Beth Cooper who first noticed the change outside. "Miss Eleanor," she said softly, "one of the men is gone." Eleanor's pulse spiked. If they were splitting up, it meant action was imminent. She made a decision that went against every instinct but felt right in her heart. "Children, we're going to play a quiet game," she announced. "I want everyone to line up behind me as quietly as little mice. We're going to visit the church and see if Reverend Matthews has any stories to tell us." The older children understood immediately. Their faces showed fear, but also determination. They began organizing the younger ones with impressive efficiency. Born from living in a place where danger was always a possibility, Martha appeared in the doorway, holding a shotgun with practiced ease. "The tunnel, Eleanor, now!" They were halfway to the root cellar when the front door burst open. The thin, nervous man stood silhouetted against the bright afternoon light, a pistol in his shaking hand. "Nobody move," he ordered, his voice cracking with tension. "We just want the schoolteacher." Eleanor stepped forward, placing herself between the gunman and her students. "I'm Eleanor Whitfield. What do you want with me?" The man's pale eyes darted nervously around the room. "You're coming with us. Mr. Hawk wants to have a conversation with you about your cooperation with the law." "Miss Eleanor, no," whispered Sarah Morrison. Clutching at Eleanor's skirt, Eleanor gently disentangled the child's hands, her heart breaking at the fear in those young eyes. "It's all right, Sarah. Remember what we learned about being brave." Before the gunman could react, Martha stepped forward with her shotgun leveled at his chest. "Mister, you picked the wrong store to threaten children in. My Tom fought Apaches for 10 years, and I learned everything he knows about handling firearms." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Eleanor could hear the children's frightened breathing behind her, could see the gunman's finger trembling on the trigger, could sense Martha's iron determination. Then the unmistakable sound of splintering wood came from the front of the store, followed by heavy footsteps. Eleanor's heart soared with relief and terror as Jack's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Let them go." The gunman spun toward Jack's voice, and in that moment of divided attention, Martha acted. The butt of her shotgun caught him across the temple with sickening force, and he crumpled to the floor unconscious. Jack appeared in the doorway, his own weapon drawn, taking in the scene with quick efficiency. Behind him came Dr. Webb and Tom Henley, both armed and ready for trouble. "Everyone all right?" Jack asked, but his eyes were on Eleanor, searching her face for signs of harm. "We're fine," Eleanor said, though her voice shook slightly. "The children are braver than most adults I know," Jack interrupted, his expression softening as he looked at the young faces peering around Eleanor's skirts. "You all did exactly right, staying calm and listening to your teacher." Dr. Webb knelt beside the unconscious gunman. "This one's alive but out cold. We should tie him up, see what he knows about Hawk's plans." Jack nodded, but his attention remained focused on Eleanor. "Where are the other two?" "Outside when we last looked," Eleanor replied. "But this one said Mr. Hawk wanted to have a conversation with me about cooperating with the law." Jack's expression darkened. "He's escalating, trying to remove key witnesses before the marshal can build his case. This won't be the last attempt." Tom Henley secured the unconscious gunman, while Martha hustled the children toward the back room. "Eleanor, dear, why don't you help me get these young ones settled with some milk and cookies? They've had quite enough excitement for one day." As the children were distracted with treats, Jack approached Eleanor. "That was well handled," he said quietly, moving them toward the tunnel, staying calm under pressure. "You probably saved lives today." Eleanor felt the delayed shock beginning to set in, her hands starting to tremble now that the immediate danger had passed. "I was terrified," she admitted, "when he pointed that gun at the children." Jack's large hands settled on her shoulders, steady and warm. "But you didn't let that fear control you. You protected them first, worried about yourself second. That's not cowardice, Eleanor. That's courage." Looking up into his storm-grey eyes, Eleanor saw something new there, not just admiration or protectiveness, but something deeper and more complex. "Jack, I know we haven't talked about it directly," he interrupted, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But Eleanor, what I feel for you, it's not something I can put aside while this trouble with Hawk plays out. If anything, seeing you in danger today made me realize I can't imagine my life without you in it." Eleanor's breath caught. "What are you saying?" Jack's hands moved from her shoulders to cup her face with infinite gentleness. "I'm saying I love you, Eleanor Whitfield. I love your courage, your dedication to these children, the way you see possibilities where others see only problems. I love how you make me want to be the man my father raised me to be, not just the weapon this town needs me to be." The words hit Eleanor like a physical force, stealing her ability to respond coherently. No one had ever spoken to her with such raw honesty, such vulnerable intensity. "Jack," she whispered, But before she could finish, Tom Henley called out urgently from the front window. "Jack, riders coming fast. Looks like the rest of Hawk's crew, and they're not happy about their missing friend." The moment shattered, as Jack instantly transformed back into the protector, all soft emotion, subsumed by hard necessity. "Get everyone to the church," he ordered. "Tom, take the children and women through the tunnel. Doc, you and I will hold them here long enough to give you a head start." Eleanor grabbed Jack's sleeve as he turned toward the front of the store. "Jack, what you said—" He stopped, looking back at her with eyes that held both love and terrible certainty. "Eleanor, if something happens to me, if I don't come back from this—" "Don't you dare," Eleanor interrupted fiercely. "Don't you tell me you love me and then talk about not coming back. We haven't had our chance yet, Jack Calloway, and I'll be damned if I let Samuel Hawke steal that from us." Jack's smile was brief but brilliant. "Yes, Mom, I'll keep that in mind." As Eleanor helped guide the children toward the tunnel, she carried with her the memory of Jack's declaration and the weight of her own unspoken response. She loved him, too, loved his strength and gentleness, his honor and his vulnerability, his willingness to stand between danger and those who couldn't protect themselves. But more than that, she was beginning to understand that love on the frontier wasn't just about tender feelings and romantic gestures. It was about choosing to stand together against whatever challenges arose, about finding someone worth fighting beside rather than someone who would fight for you. The sound of gunshots from the front of the store made her heart clench with fear and determination in equal measure. Jack had told her he loved her, and she'd be damned if she'd let him face the consequences of that love alone. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, Eleanor Whitfield was truly angry, not just at the men who threatened her students, but at the idea that anyone would dare try to destroy the chance for happiness she and Jack had found together. And as she'd learned over the past weeks, an angry schoolteacher could be a formidable force indeed. The gunfight at the general store lasted less than 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes changed everything. Eleanor emerged from the tunnel behind the church to find Jack standing over 2 wounded men while Dr. Webb tended their injuries with professional detachment. The third member of Hawk's crew had fled, no doubt carrying word back to his boss that their intimidation tactics had failed spectacularly. "Is everyone all right?" Eleanor asked, her eyes automatically searching Jack for signs of injury. "We're fine," Jack replied, though she noticed he favored his left arm slightly. "Few scrapes, nothing serious. More importantly, our prisoner is awake and talking." The thin, nervous gunman who'd threatened the children was now tied securely to a chair. In Dr. Webb's office, his earlier bravado replaced by obvious terror. Eleanor could hear him through the open window, his voice high and desperate, as he answered Marshal Brandon's questions. "Told us Hawk had legal claim to everything, said we were just collecting what was rightfully his, and the forged documents." Marshal Brandon's voice was calm but implacable. "I don't know nothing about forgeries. Hawk showed us the papers, said they was legal and proper." Eleanor moved closer to the window, Jack beside her. The captured man was younger than she'd initially thought, probably not yet 20, with the desperate look of someone who'd gotten in far deeper than he'd intended. "Hawk's got a strong box in his camp," the young man continued. "Keeps all his papers there along with—" He stopped abruptly, as though realizing he was about to reveal too much. "Along with what?" Marshal Brandon pressed, the gunman's eyes darted nervously. "Money, lots of money, more than he could make just from land speculation." Jack and Eleanor exchanged glances. "What kind of money?" Eleanor whispered. Inside the office, Marshal Brandon was asking the same question. "What kind of money? Gold, silver, banknotes?" "All kinds," the young man admitted, "but mostly gold coins, real old ones. Spanish stuff looked like, and some jewelry, fancy pieces that looked like they belonged to rich folks." Eleanor felt Jack go very still beside her. When she looked at his face, she saw an expression she'd never seen before, recognition mixed with something that looked like buried pain. "Jack," she said quietly, "what is it?" Instead of answering, Jack strode into Dr. Webb's office. Eleanor followed, arriving just as Jack addressed the prisoner directly. "This jewelry, describe it." The young gunman looked confused but complied. "There was a woman's necklace, real pretty, with green stones set in gold, and a man's ring with some kind of family crest carved into it. Hawk said it was worth a fortune, part of his inheritance from back east." Jack's hands clenched into fists. "What did the family crest look like?" "I don't know. Like a bird or something. Maybe an eagle, with letters underneath." "Why? What's it matter?" But Jack was already turning to Marshal Brandon. "Marshal, I need to show you something. Eleanor, would you come with us?" They walked in tense silence to Jack's cabin, a simple but well-built structure on the outskirts of town that Eleanor had never entered before. Inside, Jack moved directly to a wooden trunk beside his bed and withdrew a small leather portfolio. "This belonged to my father," Jack said, opening the portfolio to reveal a collection of documents and a single daguerreotype. The photograph showed a distinguished-looking man in his 30s, wearing a suit and holding a gold pocket watch, the same watch Jack now carried. But it was one of the documents that made Eleanor gasp. It was a land deed, written in formal legal language, clearly establishing ownership of vast tracts of land in and around Cedar Ridge. The signature at the bottom read, "Theodore Calloway," and beside it was an official seal featuring an eagle with outstretched wings. "Jack," Marshal Brandon said slowly, "this deed predates any of Hawke's claims by 15 years. My father was the original settler in this valley," Jack confirmed. "He filed proper claims, paid for surveys, built the first permanent structures. When he died, all of this should have passed to me legally." Eleanor studied the deed more carefully, her teacher's eye picking up important details. "Jack, according to this document, you own not just your cabin and the surrounding land. You own the property where the school sits, the general store, even the church. Nearly half of Cedar Ridge belongs to you legally, but Hawke's been claiming it all," Marshal Brandon added grimly, "using forged documents to prove ownership of land that was never his to claim." Jack sank into a chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "I never pressed the legal claims because I didn't want people thinking I was trying to lord over them. This was supposed to be my father's dream of a community where everyone could prosper, not my personal kingdom." Eleanor felt pieces clicking into place in her mind. "The jewelry your prisoner described, it belonged to your parents, didn't it?" Jack nodded slowly. "My mother's emerald necklace and my father's signet ring. They were buried with them in the family plot behind the cabin. Someone," his voice turned hard as granite, "someone desecrated their graves." The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Hawke hadn't just been running a land swindle, he'd been robbing the dead, stealing family heirlooms to finance his fraudulent operation. The cruelty of it, the casual violation of everything sacred, made her sick with rage. Marshal Brandon was studying the legal documents with growing excitement. "Jack, this changes everything. With these papers and the prisoner's testimony about stolen grave goods, we can not only stop Hawke's land grab, we can charge him with grave robbing, theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud. That's enough to put him away for 20 years. "There's more," Jack said grimly. He reached into the trunk again and withdrew another document, this one bearing official seals and ribbons. "My father's last will and testament, filed with the territorial government in Denver, properly witnessed and notarized." Eleanor scanned the will quickly, her heart sinking as she understood the implications. "Jack, why didn't you ever tell anyone about this?" "Because I was afraid," Jack admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid people would see me differently if they knew I owned half the town. Afraid they'd think I was just another rich man's son, playing at being a frontiersman. Afraid they'd start treating me like a landlord instead of a neighbor." "Marshal." Brandon folded the documents carefully. "Jack, I understand your concerns, but this information could have prevented a lot of suffering. Hawke's been terrorizing families, burning barns, threatening children. You think I don't know that?" Jack's voice cracked with emotion. "You think I haven't been carrying that guilt every day since he showed up? Every time one of Hawke's men threatened someone, every time a family got scared enough to consider selling their land for pennies, I knew I could stop it with a piece of paper, and I chose not to." Eleanor moved to Jack's side, placing her hand on his shoulder. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the weight of responsibility and regret he'd been carrying alone. "Why? Now? Why are you sharing this now?" Jack looked up at her, his storm-grey eyes bright with unshed tears. "Because I realized something today when I thought I might lose you. All this time I've been trying to honor my father's dream by being humble, by not asserting my legal rights. But my father's real dream wasn't about land ownership. It was about protecting the people he cared about." He stood and took Eleanor's hands in his. "When that gunman pointed his weapon at you and the children, When I realized Hawk was willing to hurt innocent people to get what he wanted, I understood that my father wouldn't have cared about appearing humble. He would have used every tool at his disposal to keep his community safe. Marshal Brandon cleared his throat. Jack, there's something else we need to discuss. If you're the legal owner of most of Cedar Ridge, then every sale Hawk has negotiated, every threat he's made, every act of intimidation, it's all been based on false premises. The families he's been pressuring have been living on your land all along. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as another implication hit her. Jack, the school. If you own the land where the schoolhouse sits, then you've been my tenant without knowing it. Jack finished quietly. Eleanor, I swear to you, I never thought of it that way. In my mind, the school belonged to the community, just like everything else my father built. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions and shifting relationships. Eleanor struggled to process what she'd learned, that the man she'd fallen in love with was not just Cedar Ridge's unofficial protector, but its largest landowner. That her independence, her sense of having carved out her own place in the world, had been partially illusory. Miss Whitfield, Marshal Brandon said gently, I know this is a lot to take in, but we need to focus on the immediate situation. With Jack's legal documents and our prisoner's testimony, we can end Hawk's threat permanently. But we need to move fast. When his man doesn't return, Hawk will know something's gone wrong. Eleanor nodded, pushing aside her personal confusion to focus on what mattered most. What do you need us to do? Jack, I need you to accompany me to the territorial capital to file formal complaints and present these documents to the court. Eleanor, I need you to testify about Hawk's threats to you and the children. Jack shook his head. I won't leave. Eleanor and the townspeople unprotected while Hawk's still free. Then we do this here, Marshal Brandon decided. Jack, as the legal landowner, you have the right to order Hawk and his men off your property. I can deputize volunteers from town to help serve the eviction notice. If Hawk resists, he will, Jack said grimly. Men like Hawk don't go quietly. When he realizes his whole operation was built on stealing from dead people and lying about legal ownership, he'll fight rather than face justice. Eleanor felt a chill of premonition. Then this isn't over. If anything, it's about to get much worse. Jack's eyes met hers, and she saw in them the same realization. The legal documents might give them the moral and legal authority to end Hawk's reign of terror, but they wouldn't prevent the violence that was coming. If anything, cornering Hawk would make him more dangerous than ever. Eleanor, Jack said. Softly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Knowing what you know now about the land, about what's coming, do you still want to stay? Because once we take this step, once we challenge Hawk directly, there's no going back. Eleanor looked around Jack's simple cabin, at the evidence of his family's legacy scattered across the table, at the face of the man who'd trusted her with his most closely guarded secrets. She thought about the children counting on her, the community that had welcomed her, the love that had grown between her and this complicated, honorable man. Jack Calloway, she said firmly, I didn't travel 3,000 miles to run away when things got difficult. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't face this alone. Jack's smile was brilliant and heartbreaking. Then God help us all. Because Samuel Hawk is about to discover what happens when he threatens the things I love most. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Hawk's remaining gunman had reached his boss during the night, and by dawn, riders had been spotted surrounding Cedar Ridge at a distance. They weren't attacking yet, but the message was clear. The town was under siege. Eleanor stood beside Jack on the steps of the church, watching Marshal Brandon organize the town's defenses with military precision. The lawman had deputized 8 men, including Dr. Webb and Tom Henley, while the women and children had been gathered in the church basement for safety. Estimated count is 12 men, Marshal Brandon reported to Jack. Well-armed, experienced fighters. They've positioned themselves to cut off all the main routes out of town. Jack studied the distant riders through a pair of field glasses borrowed from Dr. Webb. Hawk's not planning to negotiate, This is his final play. Eliminate the witnesses, destroy the evidence, and claim the whole valley by force. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. What about your legal documents? Surely when word reaches the territorial capital, Eleanor, men like Hawke don't respect courts or laws when their backs are against the wall, Jack interrupted gently. He knows those documents prove his guilt. His only choice now is to make sure they never reach a judge. Marshal Brandon nodded grimly. Which means he'll try to take the papers by force, probably kill anyone who can testify against him. We're not just fighting for your land claims, Jack. We're fighting for our lives. The weight of responsibility settled on Jack's shoulders like a familiar burden. Eleanor watched him transform before her eyes, from the gentle man who carved wooden horses into the deadly protector Cedar Ridge needed him to be. But this time she saw something different in his face, not just grim acceptance, but fierce determination. Marshal, I want to try something before the shooting starts, Jack said. Hawkes built his whole operation on lies and intimidation. Maybe it's time someone called his bluff publicly. What do you have in mind? Jack's smile was hard as winter granite. I'm going to walk out there and serve him with an eviction notice. As the legal landowner, I have the right to order him off my property. When he refuses, every man in this town will see him for what he really is, a thief and a grave robber with no legal standing whatsoever. Marshal Brandon shook his head. Jack, that's suicide. He'll gun you down before you get within 50 yards. Maybe. Or maybe he'll be curious enough to hear what I have to say. Either way, it'll force his hand, make him commit to his course of action instead of sitting out there trying to starve us out. Eleanor grabbed Jack's arm, her heart hammering with fear. Jack, you can't just walk out there alone. It's exactly what he wants, a chance to kill you without witnesses. Jack covered her hand with his own, his touch gentle despite the violence gathering around them. Eleanor, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about my father facing the same kinds of choices I'm facing now. You were right. He didn't build this community by avoiding confrontation. He built it by standing up to threats and protecting the people he cared about. Then let me come with you, Eleanor said desperately. If you're going to make a stand, if you're going to honor your father's legacy. No. The word came out sharper than Jack intended, and he immediately softened his tone. Eleanor, I need you here, keeping the children calm, making sure they know their teacher isn't abandoning them. That's your role in this fight. Not standing beside me when the bullets fly, but being the reason it's worth fighting in the first place. Before Eleanor could argue further, young Tommy Fletcher came running up the church steps, his face flushed with excitement and fear. Mr. Jack, Mr. Jack, one of the bad men is riding toward town with a white flag. Everyone turned to see a lone rider approaching slowly, a piece of white cloth tied to the barrel of his rifle. Even at a distance, Eleanor could see it was Samuel Hawke himself, sitting his horse with the arrogant confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. Well, Jack said grimly, looks like Hawke wants to talk after all. Marshal. Brandon checked his weapon. Could be a trap. Probably is, Jack agreed, but it's also an opportunity. He turned to Eleanor, his storm-grey eyes intense with emotion he was trying to control. Eleanor, before I go out there, before whatever happens next, I need you to know something. Jack, let me finish. His hands found hers, holding them with desperate gentleness. These past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life, not just because of how I feel about you, but because of who you've helped me become. You've shown me that I can be both protector and partner, that strength doesn't have to mean standing alone. Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes. Jack, you're talking like this is goodbye. Maybe it is, he admitted. And if it is, I want you to know that loving you has been worth every risk, every complication, every moment of uncertainty. You've given me back my father's dream, not just of land and community, but of what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. Before Eleanor could respond, Jack leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the gentle, tentative kiss she might have expected, but something fierce and desperate, a declaration of love and a farewell wrapped into one moment of perfect intensity. When they broke apart, Eleanor saw her own feelings reflected in Jack's eyes. Love, fear, hope, and terrible uncertainty about what the next hour would bring. "I love you too," she whispered. "And Jack Calloway, you'd better come back to me, because I have no intention of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been." Jack's smile was brilliant and heartbreaking. "Yes, ma'am. I'll keep that in mind." As Jack and Marshal Brandon walked out to meet Hawk, Eleanor remained on the church steps with the other townspeople, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could see the two groups converging in the dusty space that served as Cedar Ridge's Main Street, Jack and the Marshal representing law and legitimate authority, Hawk representing the kind of violent greed that had plagued the frontier since the first settlers arrived. The conversation was too distant for Eleanor to hear individual words, but she could read the body language clearly enough. Hawk sat his horse with casual insolence, gesturing broadly as though he owned everything in sight. Jack stood with feet planted firmly, his father's legal documents in one hand, his other hand resting near his weapon. "What do you think they're saying?" whispered Martha, who had joined Eleanor on the steps. "Hawk's probably making threats, trying to convince Jack that resistance is futile," Eleanor replied, never taking her eyes off the confrontation. "Jack's giving him one last chance to leave peacefully before the law comes down on him." The conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes before Hawk wheeled his horse around and rode back toward his men without another word. Jack and Marshal Brandon returned to the church at a measured pace, their faces grim but determined. "Well?" Dr. Webb asked as they climbed the steps. "About what we expected," Jack reported. "Hawk claims the legal documents are forgeries, says. He has prior claim to everything in the valley and demands that we surrender all stolen property by sunset. And if we don't," Jack's expression grew hard, "he'll burn the town and kill anyone who resists. Says he has legal authority from territorial investors back east." Eleanor felt ice form in her veins. "You don't believe him about the legal authority?" "Not for a minute," Marshal Brandon interjected. "But it doesn't matter what we believe. Hawk's convinced his men that they're on the right side of the law. That makes them dangerous, because they think they're justified in whatever they do to us." Jack pulled out his father's pocket watch and checked the time. 6 hours until sunset. That gives us time to prepare, but not much. For the next several hours, Cedar Ridge transformed itself into a fortress. Jack's knowledge of military tactics, learned during his service with the territorial militia, proved invaluable as he positioned the town's defenders at strategic points. Windows were boarded up except for rifle slots, ammunition was distributed, and makeshift barricades were erected at key intersections. Eleanor found herself assigned to the church with Martha and the other women, officially to keep the children calm, but really to serve as a final line of defense if the men's positions were overrun. She accepted a rifle from Tom Henley with steady hands, grateful for the shooting lessons her brother had insisted on back in Philadelphia. "Miss Eleanor," said Mary Beth Cooper, looking older than her 12 years, "are we going to be all right?" Eleanor knelt beside the girl, choosing her words carefully. "Mary Beth, I can't promise you that nothing bad will happen. But I can promise you that every adult in this town will do everything in their power to keep you safe. And sometimes, when good people stand together against bullies, they discover they're stronger than they ever imagined." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Eleanor climbed to the church's bell tower to get a better view of the approaching confrontation. From that vantage point, she could see Hawk's men beginning to move into position around the town's perimeter. They were professional in their movements, suggesting military experience or at least extensive practice in this kind of warfare. But she could also see Jack's preparations, the carefully positioned riflemen, the strategic placement of obstacles, the way every approach to the town center had been turned into a potential killing field for attackers. Whatever else might be said about Jack Calloway, he understood the deadly mathematics of frontier combat. As the church bell began to toll, 6 o'clock, Eleanor saw Jack emerge from his position behind the general store. He walked slowly toward the center of town, his father's rifle cradled in his arms, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who had made peace with whatever came next. Eleanor's breath caught as she realized what he was doing. Jack wasn't just preparing to defend the town. He was drawing Hawk's attention, making himself the primary target to reduce the danger to everyone else. "You stubborn, brave, impossible man," she whispered, her heart breaking with love and terror in equal measure. The sun touched the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Eleanor of the blood that might soon stain Cedar Ridge's dusty streets. In the distance, she could see Hawk's riders beginning to move, closing in on the town like wolves circling a campfire. The battle for Cedar Ridge and for the future Eleanor and Jack might build together was about to begin, but as Eleanor watched Jack take his position in the town's center, she felt something she hadn't expected, a fierce, burning certainty that whatever happened in the next few hours, Samuel Hawke had already lost the most important battle. He'd united a community against him, turned ordinary people into defenders of something worth fighting for. And in her heart, Eleanor knew that kind of unity, that kind of shared purpose, was stronger than any number of hired guns or forged documents. Tati, question now, was whether it would be strong enough to keep the man she loved alive, long enough to discover what they could build together in the peace that would follow. The first shots came just as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, muzzle, flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the gathering dusk. Eleanor pressed herself against the bell tower window, watching the battle unfold with a mixture of terror and fierce pride as the people of Cedar Ridge stood their ground. Hawke's men had approached from 3 directions, trying to divide the defenders' attention, but Jack's positioning proved its worth immediately. The attackers found themselves caught in crossfire from concealed positions, their horses rearing and screaming as bullets whistled through the air around them. Eleanor could see Jack clearly from her elevated position. He moved from cover to cover with fluid grace, his father's rifle speaking with deadly accuracy. Every shot was deliberate, measured, designed not just to stop attackers but to protect the townspeople who had trusted their lives to his leadership. But the odds were still against them. Hawke's men were experienced fighters, and they quickly adapted their tactics to the defenders' positions. Eleanor watched in horror as 2 of them flanked Dr. Webb's position behind the bank, forcing the older man to retreat toward the church. "Miss Eleanor," Martha called from below, "Dr. Webb's coming in wounded." Eleanor climbed down from the tower to find Webb clutching his left shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. His face was pale but determined as Martha helped him to a chair. "How bad?" Eleanor asked, moving to examine the wound. "Clean through," Webb gasped. "Missed the bone, thank God. But they're pushing harder on the east side than Jack expected. Tom's position is about to be overrun." Eleanor looked toward the east-facing windows and saw the truth of Webb's words. Muzzle flashes were getting closer to the church, and she could hear the sound of boots running on the wooden sidewalks outside. "Martha, get the children to the root cellar," Eleanor ordered, surprised by the authority in her own voice. "All of them now. What about you?" Eleanor checked the rifle Tom had given her, making sure it was loaded and ready. "Someone needs to watch the windows. Make sure they don't get inside the church." Martha's eyes widened. "Eleanor, you can't." "I can, and I will." Eleanor's voice was steady, despite the fear clawing at her chest. "These children are my responsibility, and I won't let Hawke's men hurt them." As Martha hurried the children toward the basement, Eleanor positioned herself at the main window facing the street. She could see the battle raging in the town center, could hear Jack's voice calling orders to his scattered defenders. But her immediate concern was the shadowy figures moving between the buildings, getting closer to the church with every passing moment. The first man appeared at the corner of the general store, rifle in hand, scanning for targets. Eleanor drew a careful bead and fired, her shot taking him high in the shoulder and spinning him around. He stumbled, but didn't fall, disappearing back into the shadows with a curse she could hear clearly. The sound of her shot seemed to draw attention to the church. Almost immediately, return fire shattered the window beside her, spraying glass. Across the floor, Eleanor ducked below the sill, her heart hammering as she realized how exposed she was. From outside came the sound of boots on the church steps, followed by the creak of the front door being tested. Eleanor crept toward the main aisle, rifle ready, trying to control her breathing as footsteps echoed in the doorway. "Anyone in here?" called a rough voice. "We know you got wounded, folks. Come out peaceful and nobody else gets hurt." Eleanor remained silent, knowing that any response would give away her position. The footsteps moved deeper into the church. Cautious, but determined. "Lady, we ain't gonna hurt you," the voice continued. "We just want the documents Calloway's got. Hand 'em over, and we'll ride out peaceful." Eleanor saw him then, a bearded man with cold eyes and nervous hands, holding his rifle like he knew how to use it. He was scanning the pews methodically, getting closer to her hiding spot with each step. She made her decision in the space between heartbeats. Rising from behind the front pew, she leveled her rifle at the intruder's chest. "The only thing you're getting from this church is a chance to walk out the way you came in," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The man's eyes widened with surprise, then narrowed with calculation. Well, the pretty schoolteacher wants to play soldier. "Lady, you best put that rifle down before you get yourself hurt." "I don't think so." Eleanor kept her weapon trained on his center mass, remembering her brother's lessons about shooting to stop a threat permanently. "You have 10 seconds to leave this church before I demonstrate exactly how well a Philadelphia lady can shoot." The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire. Eleanor could hear the battle raging outside, could smell gunpowder and blood on the evening air. But her entire world had narrowed to this moment, this choice between courage and surrender. The intruder shifted his weight, and Eleanor saw his intentions in his eyes a split second before he moved. His rifle came up fast, but not fast enough. Eleanor's shot took him center mass, the impact lifting him off his feet and slamming him backward into the church wall. Eleanor stared at what she had done, her hands trembling as the magnitude of taking a life settled into her consciousness. She had killed a man, ended a human life to protect children who trusted her. The weight of that choice would stay with her forever, but she felt no regret. Some lines could not be crossed. Some responsibilities could not be abandoned. The sound of running feet outside snapped her back to immediate awareness. More of Hawke's men were approaching, drawn by the gunfire from the church. Eleanor reloaded quickly, positioning herself to cover the main entrance. But before the next wave of attackers could reach the church, a new sound filled the air, the thunder of hooves approaching fast from the north. Eleanor risked a glance through the shattered window and felt her heart soar with hope. Riders were pouring into Cedar Ridge from the direction of the territorial capital, at least 20 men with badges glinting on their vests and rifles in their hands. Marshal Brandon's urgent message had reached the authorities, and help had finally arrived. The effect on Hawke's men was immediate and devastating. Caught between the town's defenders and the new arrivals, they found themselves hopelessly outnumbered. Eleanor watched several of them throw down their weapons in surrender, while others tried desperately to reach their horses and escape. But Samuel Hawke himself was not among those who surrendered. Eleanor could see him near the center of town, still mounted, still fighting, his pale eyes wild with the desperation of a man watching his carefully constructed plans crumble around him. And she could see Jack, moving toward Hawke with grim determination, his rifle ready for the final confrontation that had been building since the day Hawke first threatened Eleanor's schoolchildren. The climax of the battle, and of everything that had brought them to this moment, was about to unfold in Cedar Ridge's dusty Main Street. Eleanor watched from the church window as Jack and Samuel Hawke faced each other in the middle of Cedar Ridge's Main Street. The arrival of the territorial lawmen had ended the general battle, but this confrontation had become deeply personal, a reckoning between two men whose philosophies of life could never coexist. Hawk sat his horse with desperate bravado, his expensive clothes torn and bloodied from the fighting. Even cornered and outnumbered, he maintained the arrogant bearing that had made him so dangerous. Jack stood on foot, his father's rifle held ready, but not yet aimed, giving Hawk one final chance to surrender with dignity. "It's over, Hawk," Jack called, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. "Your men are captured or fled. The territorial marshals have your forged documents. Surrender now, and you'll live to stand trial." Hawk's laugh was sharp and bitter. Stand trial for what? For claiming what was rightfully mine, for bringing civilization to this God-forsaken wilderness. "For robbing graves," Jack replied, his voice cold as winterstone. "For stealing from dead people who couldn't defend themselves. For threatening children to cover your crimes." Eleanor saw Hawk's face contort with rage at the accusations. His hand moved toward the pistol at his hip, and she knew the talking was over. "Are you self-righteous fool?" Hawk snarled. "You think hiding behind your father's legacy makes you better than me? I built something out here, created opportunity, brought investment capital, gave people chances they never would have had otherwise." "You built lies on stolen land," Jack corrected. "And when people saw through those lies, you threatened to burn down their homes and kill their children. That's not civilization, Hawk. That's the worst kind of barbarism." Eleanor held her breath as the two men stared at each other across 20 feet of dusty ground. Around them, the territorial marshals had formed a loose circle, but this was clearly Jack's fight to finish. "I should have killed you weeks ago," Hawk said, his veneer of civilization finally cracking completely. "Should have put a bullet in your back the first time you interfered with my business." "Maybe," Jack agreed. "But you didn't, because you thought you were smarter than everyone else, thought you could intimidate and manipulate your way to whatever you wanted." Hawk's hand twitched toward his weapon. "I still can." "No," Jack said quietly. "You can't, because you made one mistake that doomed everything you tried to build here." "What mistake?" Jack's expression softened slightly, and Eleanor saw him glance toward the church window where she stood. "You threatened the woman I love. You pointed guns at children under her protection. That made this personal in a way you'll never understand." Eleanor felt tears burn her eyes at Jack's words. Even now, facing a desperate gunfighter in mortal combat, he was thinking of her, of the children, of everything worth protecting in their small community. Hawk's sneer was ugly and contemptuous. "Your woman, that dried-up schoolmom. Jack, you could have any saloon girl between here and Denver, and you choose a spinster with more books than sense?" The insult hit Jack like a physical blow, and Eleanor saw his jaw tighten with barely controlled fury. "Don't!" Jack warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Don't talk about her." "Why not?" Hawk pressed, sensing an advantage. "What's she going to do when she gets tired of playing house on the frontier? Run back east to find herself a proper husband with money and breeding. Face it, Jack, women like her don't stay with men like us." Eleanor wanted to shout, wanted to tell Hawk exactly how wrong he was about her feelings for Jack, but she remained silent, understanding instinctively that this was Jack's moment to resolve not just the immediate threat, but all his doubts about whether he was worthy of love. "You're wrong," Jack said simply. "About her, about me, about everything that matters. Eleanor Whitfield is the bravest, most principled person I've ever known. She came out here to teach children, and she stayed to build something better with people who understand what loyalty means." Hawk's hand moved toward his gun. "Pretty words, Jack. Let's see if they stop bullets." The two men drew simultaneously, their movements a blur of practiced speed. Eleanor's heart stopped as she watched the scene unfold with terrible clarity. Hawk's revolver clearing its holster a fraction of a second faster, the muzzle flash as he fired first, Jack's rifle coming up even as Hawk's bullet struck him. Jack staggered but didn't fall, his own shot booming through the evening air. Hawk's body jerked in the saddle, his pistol flying from nerveless fingers as Jack's bullet found its mark. For a moment that seemed to last forever, both men remained upright. Jack swaying on his feet, Hawk clutching his chest with growing horror. Then Hawk toppled from his horse, landing in the dust, with a sound that seemed to echo the collapse of all his schemes and ambitions. Jack dropped to one knee, his rifle falling from his hands as he pressed his left hand to his right shoulder, where Hawk's bullet had struck. Eleanor saw the blood seeping between his fingers and felt her heart clench with terror. Without thinking, she ran from the church, her teaching slate still clutched in her hand from where she'd grabbed it as an impromptu shield. She reached Jack's side just as Dr. Webb arrived, his own wound forgotten in his concern for the younger man. "Jack!" Eleanor knelt beside him, her hands fluttering over his injury with desperate concern. "How bad is it?" "Clean through," Webb diagnosed quickly, his experienced hands probing the wound. "Missed the bone and major vessels. He'll be laid up for a few weeks, but he'll live." Eleanor felt tears of relief streaming down her face. "You stubborn, brave, impossible man. I thought I'd lost you." Jack's smile was weak but genuine. "Takes more than a coward's bullet to keep me from you. Besides, I made a promise to come back." Around them, the territorial marshals were securing the scene and tending to the wounded. Samuel Hawke lay motionless in the dust, his reign of terror ended permanently. His surviving men sat under guard, facing long prison sentences for their crimes. "Is it over?" Eleanor asked, hardly daring to believe that the nightmare that had consumed their lives for weeks was finally finished. "It's over," Jack confirmed, his free hand finding hers and holding tight. "Hawke's dead, his men are captured, and the legal documents prove everything we claimed. Cedar Ridge is safe." Eleanor looked around at their small community. At Martha, helping Dr. Webb tend the wounded, at Tom Henley comforting frightened children, at neighbors who had risked everything to stand together against a common threat. They had won more than just a battle. They had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to surrender their principles. "Jack," she said softly, "about what Hawke said, about me running back east." "Eleanor, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." Eleanor's voice was firm, despite her tears. "I need you to understand something. I didn't stay in Cedar Ridge because I had nowhere else to go. I stayed because this is where I belong, with you, with these children, with this community we've built together." Jack's eyes searched her face, looking for doubt or uncertainty. Instead, he found only love and unshakable determination. "Eleanor Whitfield," he said quietly, "will you marry me? Will you help me build the kind of community my father dreamed of, a place where children can grow up safe and educated, where people look out for each other, where love is stronger than fear?" Eleanor's smile was brilliant through her tears. "Jack Calloway, I thought you'd never ask." As the sun set completely and stars began to appear in the vast western sky, Eleanor helped Jack to his feet and supported him as they walked toward Dr. Webb's office for proper medical attention. Behind them, the people of Cedar Ridge began the work of cleaning up and rebuilding, secure in the knowledge that they had faced the worst kind of evil and emerged victorious. The battle was over, but the real work, the work of building a life and a community based on love, courage, and mutual respect, was just beginning. 3 months later, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the newly rebuilt schoolhouse, watching her students practice their penmanship in the golden light of early spring. The building was larger now, with proper windows that let in plenty of light, and a pot-bellied stove that would keep everyone warm through the winter months ahead. But the most precious addition wasn't architectural. It was the brass bell that once again called children to learning each morning, its clear voice carrying across Cedar Ridge like a promise of hope fulfilled. Miss Eleanor called Tommy Fletcher, now 8 years old, and reading at a level that would have impressed teachers back in Philadelphia. "Are you going to be Miss Eleanor forever? Or are you going to be Mrs. Jack, like everyone says?" Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest at the innocent question. "Well, Tommy, I'll always be your teacher, no matter what name I go by. But you're right. In 2 weeks I'm going to marry Mr. Jack, and then I'll be Mrs. Calloway." The children erupted in excited chatter, and Eleanor had to ring the small handbell on her desk to restore order. It was a good problem to have, enthusiasm, for learning and for the future that awaited their small community. The transformation of Cedar Ridge in the months since Hawke's defeat had been remarkable. With the threat removed and Jack's legal ownership clearly established, new families had begun arriving weekly. A proper doctor had joined Dr. Webb, bringing his wife, who served as the town's first official nurse. A blacksmith had opened shop, along with a carpenter and a seamstress. Most importantly, Jack had made good on his promise to honor his father's dream. Instead of asserting his rights as landowner, he had donated lots to the church, the school, and other community institutions. Families who had been farming his land for years received clear deeds to their property, while newcomers could purchase land at fair prices that helped fund further improvements. Mrs. Calloway, Eleanor murmured to herself, testing the sound of her new name. She liked it, not because it changed who she was, but because it represented the partnership she and Jack had built together. The sound of familiar footsteps on the porch drew her attention to the doorway, where Jack appeared with his hat in. His hands, his right arm still bore the stiffness from Hawke's bullet, but Dr. Webb assured them both that full strength would return with time. "Afternoon, class," Jack said, his deep voice bringing smiles to every young face in the room. "Afternoon." "Mr. Jack," the children chorused back. "Mr. Jack," said Mary Beth Cooper, now 13, and serving as Eleanor's assistant with the younger children, "are you going to teach us woodworking like you promised?" Jack's smile transformed his entire face. "As a matter of fact, that's exactly why I'm here. Miss Eleanor, would you mind if I borrowed your students for an hour? I've got something special to show them." Eleanor nodded, curious about what Jack had planned. She followed as he led the children behind the schoolhouse to where he had set up a proper workshop, complete with child-sized tools and workbenches. "Today," Jack announced, "we're going to learn how to make something beautiful and useful. Everyone's going to build their own birdhouse to take home." The next hour was filled with the sounds of careful sawing, gentle hammering, and Jack's patient voice, explaining techniques that his own father had taught him decades earlier. Eleanor watched him guide small hands, offer encouragement when someone made a mistake, and beam with pride when each child successfully completed their project. This was the Jack Calloway she had fallen in love with, not just the protector who could face down dangerous men, but the gentle teacher who believed in nurturing the next generation. Watching him with the children, Eleanor could easily imagine him with children of their own someday, passing on the values and skills that would help them build good lives. As the workshop session ended and parents began arriving to collect their children, Jack approached Eleanor with something hidden behind his back. "I have something for you too," he said, suddenly shy despite everything they had been through together. He brought his hand forward to reveal an exquisite wooden jewelry box, its surface polished to a warm glow and carved with delicate wildflowers. At the same flowers he had picked for her during their courtship. Eleanor gasped as she opened the box, revealing a ring nestled in blue velvet. It wasn't the elaborate diamond engagement ring that Philadelphia society would have expected, but something far more meaningful. A simple gold band set with a small emerald that caught the afternoon light like captured hope. "It was my grandmother's," Jack explained. "The emerald came from my mother's necklace, the one Hawke stole from her grave. The territorial marshal recovered it along with the other stolen items, and I had a jeweler in Denver reset the stone." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she understood the significance. "Jack, this is a new beginning built on honoring the past," he finished. "Like us, like this whole town." Jack knelt on one knee in front of the schoolhouse, in full view of parents and children who had stopped to witness the moment. "Eleanor Whitfield, you came to Cedar Ridge as our teacher, but you've become so much more. You've been our defender, our inspiration, and my partner in every way that matters. Will you marry me and help me build the future my parents dreamed of?" Eleanor looked around at the faces surrounding them. children she had taught, parents who had trusted her with their most precious treasures, neighbors who had become family. This was her community now. These were her people, and this remarkable. Man was offering her a chance to build something lasting and beautiful together. "Yes," she said simply, letting him slip the ring onto her finger. "Yes, Jack Calloway, I'll marry you." The cheer that went up from the assembled crowd could probably be heard in the next county. Children clapped and laughed, parents offered congratulations, and Martha Henley wiped away tears of joy. As the excitement gradually subsided and people began heading home to their evening chores, Eleanor and Jack found themselves alone on the schoolhouse steps, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Any regrets?" Jack asked quietly. "About Philadelphia? About the life you left behind?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, then shook her head with complete certainty. "The only thing I regret is how long it took me to find you in this place. Jack, I've never been happier, never felt more useful, never been more sure that I'm exactly where I belong." Jack's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Even when winter comes and the snow piles up to the windows, even when the next crisis threatens our little community, even when I revert to being the intimidating mountain of a man who scared you that first day." Eleanor laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to dance on the evening breeze. "Especially. Then, Jack, you were never intimidating to me. Not really. From the very first day I saw the gentle heart beneath the strong exterior. That's what I fell in love with, and that's what I'm looking forward to spending the rest of my life discovering." 2 weeks later, on a perfect spring morning with wildflowers blooming across the meadows surrounding Cedar Ridge, Eleanor walked down the aisle of the little church, wearing her mother's wedding dress and carrying a bouquet of prairie roses. Jack waited at the altar, resplendent in a new suit, but still wearing his father's pocket watch, his face shining with love and anticipation. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with heartfelt warmth, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, the entire community erupted in celebration. The reception that followed featured Martha's famous apple pies, Tom's best whiskey, and dancing that lasted until well past midnight. But Eleanor's favorite moment came at the end of the evening. When she and Jack finally found themselves alone in the cabin he had spent months expanding and beautifying for their life together. As he carried her across the threshold, Eleanor looked around at the home they would share, at the wooden horse he had carved for her sitting on the mantel, at the restored schoolhouse bell visible through the window, at the wedding ring forged from frontier gold glinting on her finger. "Mrs. Calloway," Jack said softly, setting her gently on her feet. "How does that sound to you?" "Perfect," Eleanor replied, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "Everything about this, about us, is perfect." Outside their window, Cedar Ridge slept peacefully under a canopy of brilliant stars. In the distance, the schoolhouse bell caught the moonlight, ready to call another generation of children to learning and hope. And in the cabin that Theodore Calloway had built with his own hands, his son and the woman who had captured his heart settled into a life built on love, courage, and the unshakable belief that the best things in life were worth fighting for. Sometimes the loneliest souls do find each other in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, when they do, they discover that love is not just about finding someone to stand beside you, but about finding someone worth becoming your best self for. In the end, that's exactly what Eleanor and Jack found in the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge. Not just love, but the chance to build something lasting and beautiful together, one day, one lesson, one act of courage at a time.